Split at the Root, an essay on Jewish identity by Adrienne Rich, 1982. For about 15 minutes, I've been sitting chin in hand in front of the typewriter, staring out at the snow, trying to be honest with myself, trying to figure out why writing this seems to be so dangerous an act, filled with fear and shame, and why it seems so necessary. It comes to me that in order to write this, I have to be willing to do two things. I have to claim my father, for I have my Jewishness from him and not from my Gentile mother. And I have to break his silence, his taboos. In order to claim him, I have, in a sense, to expose him. And there is, of course, the third thing. I have to face the sources and the flickering presence of my own ambivalence as a Jew. The daily, mundane anti-semitisms of my entire life. These are stories I've never tried to tell before. Why now? Why, I asked myself sometime last year, does this question of Jewish identity float so impalpably, so ungraspably around me, a cloud I can't quite see the outlines of, which feels to me to be without definition? And yet I've been on the track of this longer than I think. In a long poem written in 1960, when I was 31 years old, I described myself as split at the root, neither Gentile nor Jew, Yankee nor rebel. I was still trying to have it both ways, to be neither nor, trying to live, brackets, with my Jewish husband and 3 children more Jewish in ancestry than I, close brackets, in the predominantly Gentile, Yankee academic world of Cambridge, Massachusetts. But this begins, for me, in Baltimore, where I was born in my father's workplace, a hospital in the Black Ghetto, whose lobby contained an immense white marble statue of Christ. My father was then a young teacher and researcher in the Department of Pathology at the Johns Hopkins Medical School, one of the very few Jews to attend or teach at that institution. He was from Birmingham, Alabama. His father, Samuel, was Ashkenazic, an immigrant from Austria-Hungary, and his mother, Hattie Rice, a Sephardic Jew from Vicksburg, Mississippi. My grandfather had a shoe store in Birmingham, which did well enough to allow him to retire comfortably and to leave my grandmother income on his death. The only souvenirs of my grandfather, Samuel Rich, were his ivory flute, which lay on our living room mantel and was not to be played with, his thin gold pocket watch, which my father wore, and his Hebrew prayer book, which I discovered among my father's books in the course of reading my way through his library. In this prayer book, there was a newspaper clipping about my grandparents' wedding, which took place in a synagogue. My father, Arnold, was sent in adolescence to a military school in the North Carolina mountains, a place for training white Southern Christian gentlemen. I suspect that there were few, if any, other Jewish boys at Colonel Bingham's or at, quote, Mr. Jefferson's University in Charlottesville, where he studied as an undergraduate. With whatever conscious forethought, Samuel and Hattie sent their son into the dominant Southern WASP culture to become an exception, to enter the professional class. Never, in describing these experiences, did he speak of having suffered from loneliness, cultural alienation, or outsiderhood. Never did I hear him use the word anti-Semitism. It was only in college, when I read a poem by Carl Shapiro beginning, "To hate the Negro and avoid the Jew is the curriculum," that it flashed on me that there was an untold side to my father's story of his student years. He looked recognizably Jewish, was short and slender in build, with dark, wiry hair and deep-set eyes, high forehead and curved nose. My mother is a Gentile. In Jewish law, I cannot count myself a Jew. If it is true that, quote, we think back through our mothers if we are women, Virginia Woolf, and I myself have affirmed this, then even according to lesbian theory, I cannot or need not count myself a Jew. The white, southern Protestant woman, the Gentile, has always been there for me to peel back into. That's a whole piece of history in itself, for my Gentile grandmother and my mother were also frustrated artists and intellectuals, a lost writer and a lost composer between them. Readers and annotators of books, note-takers, my mother a good pianist still in her 80s. But there was also the obsession with ancestry, with, quote, background, the southern talk of family, not as people you would necessarily know and depend on, but as heritage, the guarantee of, quote, good breeding. There was the inveterate romantic heterosexual fantasy, the mother telling the daughter how to attract men, brackets, my mother often used the word fascinate, close brackets, the assumption that relations between the sexes could only be romantic, that it was in the woman's interest to cultivate, quote, mystery, conceal her actual feelings. Survival tactics of a kind, I think today, knowing what I know about the white woman's sexual role in the southern racist scenario. Heterosexuality as protection, but also drawing white women deeper into collusion with white men. It would be easy to push away and deny the Gentile in me, that white southern woman, that social Christian. At different times in my life, I have wanted to push away one or the other burden of inheritance, to say merely, I am a woman, I am a lesbian. If I call myself a Jewish lesbian, do I thereby try to shed some of my southern Gentile white woman's culpability? If I call myself only through my mother, is it because I pass more easily through a world where being a lesbian often seems like outsiderhood enough? According to Nazi logic, my two Jewish grandparents would have made me a Mischling first degree, non-exempt from the final solution. The social world in which I grew up was Christian virtually without needing to say so. Christian imagery, music, language, symbols, assumptions everywhere. It was also a genteel, white, middle-class world in which common was a term of deep opprobrium. Common white people might speak of the N-word. We were taught never to use that word. We said Negroes, brackets, even as we accepted segregation, the eating taboo, the assumption that black people were simply of a separate species, close brackets. Our language was more polite, distinguishing us from the, quote, rednecks or the lynch mob mentality. But so charged with negative meaning was even the word Negro that as children we were taught never to use it in front of black people. We were taught that any mention of skin colour in the presence of coloured people was treacherous, forbidden ground. In a parallel way, the word Jew was not used by polite Gentiles. I sometimes heard my best friend's father, a Presbyterian minister, allude to the Hebrew people, or people of the Jewish faith. The world of acceptable folk was white, Gentile, Christian really, and had, quote, ideals, brackets, which coloured people, white, common people, were not supposed to have. Ideals and manners included not hurting someone's feelings by calling her or him a Negro or a Jew, naming the hated identity. This is the mental framework of the 1930s and 1940s in which I was raised. Brackets. Writing this, I feel dimly like the betrayer of my father, who did not speak the word, of my mother who must have trained me in the messages, of my caste and class, of my whiteness itself. Close brackets. 2 memories. I am in a play reading at school of The Merchant of Venice. Whatever Jewish law says, I am quite sure I was seen as Jewish, with a reassuringly Gentile mother, in that double vision that bigotry allows. I am the only Jewish girl in the class, and I am playing Portia. As always, I read my part aloud for my father the night before, and he tells me to convey with my voice more scorn and contempt with the word Jew. Quote, therefore, Jew. I have to say the word out and say it loudly. I was encouraged to pretend to be a non-Jewish child acting a non-Jewish character who has to speak the word Jew emphatically. Such a child would not have had trouble with the part. But I must have had trouble with the part, if only because the word itself was really taboo. I can see that there was a kind of terrible, bitter bravado about my father's way of handling this. And who would not dissociate from Shylock in order to identify with Portia? As a Jewish child who was also a female, I loved Portia, and, like every other Shakespearean heroine, she proved a treacherous role model. A year or so later, I am in another play, The School for Scandal, in which a notorious spendthrift is described as having many excellent friends among the Jews. In neither case was anything explained, either to me or to the class at large, about this scorn for Jews and the disgust surrounding Jews and money. Money, when Jews wanted it, had it, or lent it to others, seemed to take on a peculiar nastiness. Jews and money had some peculiar and unspeakable relation. At this same school, in which we had Episcopalian hymns and prayers and read aloud through the Bible morning after morning, I gained the impression that Jews were in the Bible and mentioned in English literature, that they had been persecuted centuries ago by the wicked Inquisition, but that they seemed not to exist in everyday life. These were the 1940s, and we were told a great deal about the Battle of Britain, the noble French resistance fighters, the brave, starving Dutch. But I did not learn of the resistance of the Warsaw Ghetto until I left home. I was sent to the Episcopal Church, baptized and confirmed, and attended it for about 5 years, though without belief. That religion seemed to have little to do with belief or commitment. It was liturgy that mattered, not spiritual passion. Neither of my parents ever entered that church, and my father would not enter any church for any reason, wedding or funeral. Nor did I enter a synagogue until I left Baltimore. When I came home from church, for a while, my father insisted on reading aloud to me from Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason, a diatribe against institutional religion. Thus, he explained, I would have a balanced view of these things, a choice. They, did not give me the choice to be a Jew. My mother explained to me when I was filling out forms for college that if any question was asked about religion, I should put down Episcopalian, rather than none. To seem to have no religion was, she implied, dangerous. But it was white social Christianity, rather than any particular Christian sect, that the world was founded on. The very word Christian was used as a synonym for virtuous, just, peace-loving, generous, etc., etc. Footnote: in a similar way, the phrase, "that's white of you," implied that you were behaving with a superior decency and morality expected of white, but not of black people. End footnote. The norm was Christian. Religion none was indeed not acceptable. Anti-Semitism was so intrinsic as not to have a name. I don't recall exactly being taught that the Jews killed Jesus. Christ killer seems too strong a term for the bland Episcopal vocabulary, but certainly we got the impression that the Jews had been caught out in a terrible mistake, failing to recognize the true Messiah, and were thereby less advanced in moral and spiritual sensibility. The Jews had actually allowed moneylenders in the temple, brackets, again, the unexplained obsession with Jews and money, close brackets. They were of the past, archaic, primitive, as older and darker cultures are supposed to be primitive. Christianity was lightness, fairness, peace on earth, and combined the feminine appeal of the meek shall inherit the earth with the masculine stride of onward Christian soldiers. Sometime in 1946, while still in high school, I read in the newspaper that a theatre in Baltimore was showing films of the Allied liberation of the Nazi concentration camps. Alone, I went downtown after school one afternoon and watched the stark, blurry, but unmistakable newsreels. When I tried to go back and touch the pulse of that girl of 16, growing up in many ways so precocious and so ignorant, I am overwhelmed by a memory of despair, a sense of inevitability more enveloping than any I'd ever known. Anne Frank's diary, and many other personal narratives of the Holocaust, were still unknown or unwritten. But it came to me that every one of those piles of corpses, mountains of shoes and clothing, had contained, simply, individuals who had believed, as I now believed of myself, that they were intended to live out a life of some kind of meaning, that the world possessed some kind of sense and order. Yet this had happened to them. And I, who believed my life was intended to be so interesting and meaningful, was connected to those dead by something. Not just mortality, but a taboo name, a hated identity. Or was I? Did I really have to be? Writing this now, I feel belated rage that I was so impoverished by the family and social worlds I lived in, that I had to try to figure out by myself what this did indeed mean for me. That I'd never been taught about resistance, only about passing. That I had no language for anti-Semitism itself. When I went home and told my parents where I had been, they were not pleased. I felt accused of being morbidly curious, not healthy, sniffing around death for the thrill of it. And since, at 16, I was often not sure of the sources of my feelings or of my motives for doing what I did, I probably accused myself as well. One thing was clear. There was nobody in my world with whom I could discuss those films. Probably at the same time, I was reading accounts of the camps in magazines and newspapers. What I remember were the films and having questions that I could not even phrase, such as, are those men and women them or us? To be able to ask even the child's astonished question, why do they hate us so, means knowing how to say we. The guilt of not knowing, the guilt of perhaps having betrayed my parents or even those victims, those survivors, through mere curiosity. These also froze in me for years the impulse to find out more about the Holocaust. (1947), I left Baltimore to go to college in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Left, I thought, the backward, enervating South for the intellectual, vital North. New England also had for me some vibration of higher moral rectitude, of moral passion even, with its 17th century Puritan self-scrutiny, its 19th century literary flowering, its abolitionist righteousness, Colonel Shaw and his black Civil War regiment depicted in granite on Boston Common. At the same time, I found myself, at Radcliffe, among Jewish women. I used to sit for hours over coffee with what I thought of as the real Jewish students, who told me about middle-class Jewish culture in America. I described my background for the first time to strangers, and they took me on, some with amusement at my illiteracy, some arguing that I could never marry into a strict Jewish family, some convinced I didn't, quote, look Jewish, others that I did. I learned the names of holidays and foods, which surnames are Jewish and which are changed names. About girls who had their noses, quote, fixed, their hair straightened. For these young Jewish women, students in the late 1940s, it was acceptable, perhaps even necessary, to strive to look as Gentile as possible. But they stuck proudly to being Jewish, expected to marry a Jew, have children, keep the holidays, carry on the culture. I felt I was testing a forbidden current, that there was danger in these revelations. I bought a reproduction of a Chagall portrait of a rabbi in striped prayer shawl and hung it on the wall of my room. I was admittedly young and trying to educate myself, but I was also doing something that is dangerous. I was flirting with identity. One day that year, I was in a small shop where I had bought a dress with a too long skirt. The shop employed a seamstress who did alterations, and she came in to pin up the skirt on me. I'm sure that she was a recent immigrant, a survivor. I remember a short, dark woman wearing heavy glasses, with an accent so foreign I could not understand her words. Something about her presence was very powerful and disturbing to me. After marking and pinning up the skirt, she sat back on her knees, looked up at me, and asked in a hurried whisper, "You Jewish?" 18 years of training in assimilation sprang into the reflex by which I shook my head, rejecting her, and muttered, "No." What was I actually saying no to? She was poor, older, struggling with a foreign tongue, anxious. She had escaped the death that had been intended for her, but I had no imagination of her possible courage and foresight, her resistance. I did not see in her a heroine who had perhaps saved many lives, including her own. I saw the frightened immigrant, the seamstress hemming the skirts of college girls, the wandering Jew. But I was an American college girl having her skirt hemmed, and I was frightened myself, I think, because she had recognized me. Brackets, "It takes one to know one," my friend Edie at Radcliffe had said. Even if I refused to recognize myself or her, even if her recognition was sharpened by loneliness or the need to feel safe with me. But why should she have felt safe with me? I myself was living with a false sense of safety. There are betrayals in my life that I have known at the very moment were betrayals. This was one of them. There are other betrayals committed so repeatedly, so mundanely, that they leave no memory trace behind, only a growing residue of misery, of dull, accreted self-hatred. Often these take the form not of words, but of silence. Silence before the joke at which everyone is laughing. The anti-woman joke, the racist joke, the anti-Semitic joke. Silence and then amnesia. Blocking it out when the oppressor's language starts coming from the lips of one we admire, whose courage and eloquence have touched us. She didn't really mean that. He didn't really say that. But the accretions build up out of sight, like scale inside a kettle. 1948. I come home from my freshman year at college, flaming with new insights, new information. I am the daughter who has gone out into the world, to the pinnacle of intellectual prestige, Harvard, fulfilling my father's hopes for me, but also exposed to dangerous influences. I have already been reproved for attending a rally for Henry Wallace and the Progressive Party. I challenged my father, "Why haven't you told me that I am Jewish? Why do you never talk about being a Jew?" He answers measuredly, "You know that I have never denied that I am a Jew, but it's not important to me. I am a scientist, a deist. I have no use for organized religion. I choose to live in a world of many kinds of people. There are Jews I admire and others who I despise. I am a person, not simply a Jew." The words are as I remember them, not perhaps exactly as spoken, but that was the message. And it contained enough truth, as all denial drugs itself on partial truth, so that it remained for the time being unanswerable, leaving me high and dry, split at the root, gasping for clarity, for air. At that time, Arnold Rich was living in suspension, waiting to be appointed to the professorship of pathology at Johns Hopkins. The appointment was delayed for years, no Jew ever having held a professional chair in that medical school. And he wanted it badly. It must have been a very bitter time for him, since he had believed so greatly in the redeeming power of excellence, of being the most brilliant, inspired man for the job. With enough excellence, you could presumably make it stop mattering that you were Jewish. You could become the only Jew in the Gentile world, a Jew so, quote, civilized, so far from common, so attractively combining Southern gentility with European cultural values, that no one would ever confuse you with the raw, pushy Jew of New York, the loud, hysterical refugees from Eastern Europe, the overdressed Jews of the urban South. We, my sister, mother, and I, were constantly urged to speak quietly in public, to dress without ostentation, to repress all vividness or spontaneity, to assimilate with a world which might see us as too flamboyant. I suppose that my mother, pure Gentile though she was, could be seen as acting common or Jewish if she laughed too loudly or spoke aggressively. My father's mother, who lived with us half the year, was a model of circumspect behaviour, dressed in dark blue or lavender, retiring in company, ladylike to an extreme, wearing no jewellery except a good gold chain, a narrow brooch, or a string of pearls. A few times within the family, I saw her anger flare, felt the passion she was repressing. But when Arnold took us out to a restaurant or on a trip, the rich women were always tuned down to some wasp level my father believed surely would protect us all, maybe also make us unrecognizable to the real Jews who wanted to seize us, drag us back to the shtetl, the ghetto, in its many manifestations. For yes, that was a message, that some Jews would be after you once they, quote, knew, to rejoin them, to re-enter a world that was messy, noisy, unpredictable, maybe poor. Even though, as my mother once wrote me, criticizing my largely Jewish choice of friends in college, some of them will be the most brilliant, fascinating people you ever meet. I wonder if that isn't one message of assimilation, of America, that the unlucky or the unachieving want to pull you backward, that to identify with them is to court downward mobility, lose the precious chance of passing, of token existence. There was always within this sense of Jewish identity a strong class discrimination. Jews might be, quote, fascinating as individuals, but came with huge, unruly families who, quote, poured chicken soup over everyone's head, in the phrase of a white Southern male poet. Anti-Semitism could thus be justified by the bad behavior of certain Jews, and if you did not effectively deny family and community, there would always be a remote cousin claiming kinship with you who was the, quote, wrong kind of Jew. I've always believed his attitude toward other Jews depended on who they were. It was my impression that Jews of this background looked down on Eastern European Jews, including Polish Jews and Russian Jews, who generally were not as well educated. This, from a letter written to me recently by a Gentile who had worked in my father's department, whom I had asked about anti-Semitism there, and in particular regarding my father. This informant also wrote me that it was hard to perceive anti-Semitism in Baltimore because the racism made so much more intense an impression. Quote, I would almost have to think that blacks went to a different heaven than the whites because the bodies were kept in a separate morgue, and some white persons did not even want blood transfusions from black donors. My father's mind was predictably racist and misogynist. Yet as a medical student, he noted in his journal that Southern male chivalry stopped at the point of any white man in a streetcar giving his seat to an old, weary black woman standing in the aisle. Was this a Jewish insight, an outsider's insight, even though the outsider was striving to be on the inside? Because what isn't named is often more permeating than what is. I believe that my father's Jewishness profoundly shaped my own identity and our family existence. They were shaped both by external anti-Semitism and my father's self-hatred, and by his Jewish pride. What Arnold did, I think, was call his Jewish pride something else: achievement, aspiration, genius, idealism. Whatever was unacceptable got left back under the rubric of Jewishness or the wrong kind of Jews, uneducated, aggressive, loud. The message I got was that we were really superior. Nobody else's father had collected so many books, had travelled so far, knew so many languages. Baltimore was a musical city, but for the most part, in the families of my school friends, culture was for women. My father was an amateur musician, read poetry, adored encyclopedic knowledge. He prowled and pounced over my school papers, insisting I use grown-up sources. He criticized my poems for faulty technique and gave me books on rhyme and meter and form. His investment in my intellect and talent was egotistical, tyrannical, opinionated, and terribly wearing. He taught me, nevertheless, to believe in hard work, to mistrust easy inspiration, to write and rewrite, to feel that I was a person of the book, even though a woman, to take ideas seriously. He made me feel, at a very young age, the power of language, and that I could share in it. The Riches were proud, but we also had to be very careful. Our behaviour had to be more impeccable than other people's. Strangers were not to be trusted, nor even friends. Family issues must never go beyond the family. The world was full of potential slanderers, betrayers, people who could not understand. Even within the family, I realized that I never in my whole life knew what my father was really feeling. Yet he spoke, monologued, with driving intensity. You could grow up in such a house, mesmerized by the local electricity, the crucial meanings assumed by the merest things. This used to seem to me a sign that we were all living on some high emotional plane. It was a difficult force field for a favoured daughter to disengage from. Easy to call that intensity Jewish, and I have no doubt that passion is one of the qualities required for survival over generations of persecution. But what happens when passion is rent from its original base, when the white Gentile world is softly saying, "Be more like us, and you can be almost one of us"? What happens when survival seems to mean closing off one emotional artery after another? His forebears in Europe had been forbidden to travel or expelled from one country after another, had special taxes levied on them if they left the city walls, had been forced to wear special clothes and badges restricted to the poorest neighbourhoods. He had wanted to be a, quote, free spirit, to travel widely among all kinds of people. Yet in his prime of life, he lived in an increasingly withdrawn world, in his house up on a hill, in a neighbourhood where Jews were not supposed to be able to buy property, depending almost exclusively on interactions with his wife and daughters to provide emotional connectedness. In his home, he created a private defence system so elaborate that even as he was dying, my mother felt unable to talk freely with his colleagues or others who might have helped her. Of course, she acquiesced in this. The loneliness of the only, the token, often doesn't feel like loneliness, but like a kind of dead echo chamber. Certain things that ought to don't resonate. Somewhere, Beverly Smith writes of women of colour, quote, inspiring the behaviour in each other. When there's nobody to inspire the behaviour, act out of the culture, there is an atrophy, a dwindling, which is partly invisible. Sometimes I feel I have seen too long from too many disconnected angles. White, Jewish, anti-Semite, racist, anti-racist, once married, lesbian, middle class, feminist, ex-matriot southerner, split at the root. That I will never bring them whole. I would have liked in this essay to bring together the meanings of anti-Semitism and racism as I have experienced them and as I believe they intersect in the world beyond my life. But I'm not able to do this yet. I feel the tension as I think, make notes. If you really look at the one reality, the other will waver and disperse. Trying in 1 week to read Angela Davis and Lucy Davidovich, trying to hold throughout to a feminist, a lesbian perspective. What does this mean? Nothing has trained me for this, and sometimes I feel inadequate to make any statement as a Jew. I feel the history of denial within me like an injury, a scar. For assimilation has affected my perceptions. Those early lapses in meaning, those blanks, are with me still. My ignorance can be dangerous to me and to others. Yet we can't wait for the undamaged to make our connections for us. We can't wait to speak until we are perfectly clear and righteous. There is no purity, and in our lifetimes, no end to this process. This essay, then, has no conclusions. It is another beginning for me. Not just a way of saying, in 1982 right-wing America, I too will wear the yellow star. It's a moving into accountability, enlarging the range of accountability. I know that in the rest of my life, the next half century or so, every aspect of my identity will have to be engaged. The middle-class white girl taught to trade obedience for privilege. The Jewish lesbian raised to be a heterosexual Gentile. The woman who first heard oppression named and analysed in the black civil rights struggle. The woman with 3 sons. The feminist who hates male violence. The woman limping with a cane. The woman who has stopped bleeding are also accountable. The poet who knows that beautiful language can lie, that the oppressor's language sometimes sounds beautiful. The woman trying, as part of her resistance, to clean up her act.